Thank you, Bernard, and thank you all for being here. I'm very honored to introduce André Aciman tonight. It's a bit tricky to sum up André. You could say that he's a celebrated author of some 10 books of fiction, nonfiction, memoir, essays. You could say that he's a distinguished professor and scholar of Proust and literary theory. You could say he's a good friend. But to read Aciman is to encounter a writer and sensibility who often likes to define himself by what he is not. These are a few of my favorite lines of his. I was born in Alexandria, Egypt, but I'm not Egyptian. I was born into a Turkish family, but I'm not Turkish. I was sent to British schools in Egypt, but I'm not British. My family became Italian citizens, and I learned to speak Italian, but my mother tongue is French. But after 3 days in France, I cannot wait to get out. Not a single ounce of me is French. I'm African by birth. Everyone in my family is from Asia Minor, and I live in America. And yet, though I lived in Europe for no more than 3 years, I consider myself profoundly, ineradicably European, the way I remain profoundly, ineradicably Jewish, though I have no faith in God, know not one Jewish ritual, and have gone to more churches in a year than synagogues in a decade. This is the space Aciman carves out. This is the space he commands in writing today. He writes about departures without arrivals, about yearning for Paris and Alexandria, yearning for Alexandria in New York in Rome. He writes love stories that are about wanting, never having, about doubt being our only certainty. He writes novels that are earthy and philosophical, resolutely unsettled, but deeply rooted in literary traditions. In short, he is his own genre. We are lucky to have him, and we are very lucky to listen to him tonight. Reading from his dazzling new novel, Find Me, André Aciman.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I love being invited to come and speak here and to read here. It's always a great joy. Now, what I want to do is, I'm going to read from my latest novel, but I should explain what I'm doing. I picked the passage in question. It's from the chapter called Cadenza, and I picked it because I know that a lot of you here in the audience love classical music, so I'm going to go there. The point of the story is Elio, who's now in his early 30s, and he meets a man who's probably twice his age, and he's a guest in his house many times. And at some point, the host presents him with a manuscript. And this is what I'll be reading. I'm going to show you, says the older man, I'm going to show you something I believe no one has ever seen. It came into my father's hands not long after the Germans left our house. When I was in my very late 20s and a few days before my father fell into a coma, he asked me, when we were alone together, to unlock a tiny cabinet and to take out a large leather envelope. My father said he was younger than I was at the time when what was in the envelope came into his possession. That's Elio speaking. What's in it? Asks Elio. Open it. I expected, says Elio, some sort of deed, will, or certificate, or a compromising set of photos. Instead, when I opened the leather folio, I found a musical score on 8 double-sided sheets of onion paper. The staffs were drawn by an unsteady hand of someone who obviously didn't own a ruler. On the front was written, from Léon to Adrien, January 18, 1944. Adrien, my father, explains Michel, Elio's lover, never explained to me what it was. All he said was, do not destroy it, do not give it away to some archive or library, just pass it on to someone who'll know exactly what to do with it. It broke my heart because from the look on his face as he spoke these words, I could tell he knew there was no one else in his life, or for that matter, in my life. I also think he just knew about me. And the strange thing, as he looked at me with that deep, searching stare of those who are about to die, was that everything between us, every moment of love, every disappointment, every misunderstanding, every coded glance, had all but dissolved. Find someone, he said. Of course, says Michel, as soon as I looked at the score, I was completely at a loss. Beyond the few years I'd spent playing the piano, I knew nothing about classical music. But there was another reason why I was truly perplexed when I took a look at it. I was born 20 years after the date on the score, and yet here was someone I'd never met, much less heard of, who bore my middle name, Léon. I asked my father who this man was, but he gave me a blank look, made a dismissive gesture with his hand, then said it would take too long, adding he was tired and that he preferred not to say, not to think. You're making me remember, and I don't want to remember, he said. I'd planned to ask him again, but the score slipped from my mind and I needed to take care of him as his condition kept worsening. In retrospect now, I almost think that what had kept him alive during his sickness was the need to find the chance to hand me the score without my mother's knowing. Months after he died, I asked around and learned that not a soul on my mother's side or my father's was called Léon. Finally, I asked my mother, who was Léon? She looked at me with a bewildered and amused look on her face. You, of course. Had there ever been another Léon, I asked. No one. Léon had been my father's idea. They had argued about names. She wanted Michel after my father's grandfather. My father insisted on Léon. She won, of course. Léon as a second name was a concession. No one ever called me Léon. As it turned out, and after I made some inquiries among the staff following the death of my father, one of the older servants did recall a certain Léon, Léon le Juif, Léon the Jew. They called him in the household, starting from my grandfather, who hated Jews, down to the cook and the chambermaids. But in the words of the same old cook, that was a very long time ago, before your parents had even met. I could tell it was going to be like pulling teeth to get our cook to explain to me, so I let the matter slide, figuring I'd ask him at some other time. All he said as I was grilling him is that the Germans were real gentlemen. They tipped him well. Now, here is Elios picking up the narrative. He's looking at the score. I'd seen some notes before, but dear God, I'd even played these notes 5 years earlier, but not quite in this order. It took some time to recognize the notes. The poor fellow had been copying Mozart. How banal. And then, worse yet, I couldn't believe it. A few bars later, and not so subtly, I thought I recognized wisps of something everyone knew. The recognizable lilting rondo lifted from Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata. Our dear Léon was lifting left and right. As I was trying to guess who or what Léon was, it suddenly hit me that there was a reason why I recognized the first series of notes. They were composed or partially composed by Mozart. But this was no sonata, no prelude, no fantasy, no fugue. This was, in fact, a cadenza to Mozart's D minor piano concerto. Léon was having fun. All he'd done was to compose the parts of the pianist Adrien was probably meant to improvise at the end of the first movement. In that brief 1 to 2 minute moment in a piano concerto when the soloist improvises upon a theme already explored in the concerto. Usually the signal for the orchestra to come clamoring back is a sort of a trill played by the pianist at the very end of the cadenza. I couldn't figure out what the trill was when I first saw it, but now it makes perfect sense. This cadenza, however, goes on and on. I don't know for how long yet, but it's obviously more than 5 to 6 minutes long. So this was my father's big secret? 6 minutes of music, and that's it, said Michel. I suppose. Doesn't add up, does it? I'm not sure yet. I have to study this. Léon keeps echoing the Waldstein. The Waldstein, Michel repeated the word with a broad smile. It took me a moment, and then once again I understood why he was smiling. Don't tell me you're twice my age and you've never heard the Waldstein Sonata. I know it inside out. Again, the smile. You're fibbing, I know it. I can tell. Of course I'm fibbing, says Michel. I stood up, went to the piano, and started playing the opening bars of the Waldstein. The Waldstein, of course, he said. Was he still joking? Actually, I've heard it many times. I stopped playing and then moved to the rondo. He said he knew it too. Then sing it, I said. I'll do no such thing. Sing it with me, I said. No. I started singing the rondo, and after a bit of coaxing, but staring at him from the piano, began hearing his tentative attempts at song. I played more slowly and then asked him to sing louder, till in the end we were singing in unison. He placed both hands on my shoulders. I thought it was a signal to stop playing, but then he said, "Don't stop," as I continued playing and singing. "What a voice you have," he said. "Keep singing." So he kept singing. When I turned around at the end of our crooning together, I noticed he had tears in his eyes. "Why?" I asked. "I don't know why. Maybe because I never sing, or maybe it's just this, being with you. I want to sing." "Don't you sing in the shower sometimes?" "Not in ages." I got up and with my left thumb wiped the tears from his eyes. "I like that we sang," I said. "I do too," he said. "Did it make you sad?" "Not at all. I was just moved as though you'd pushed me out of myself. I like it when you do that, push me out of myself. Plus, I'm so shy that I tear up as easily as some people blush." "You shy? I don't think you're shy at all." "You wouldn't believe how shy. You spoke to me out of nowhere, picked me up actually, and in a church of all places, and then you took me out to dinner. Shy people don't do any of this." "The reason it happened that way is because I wasn't planning any of it. It all came so easily, maybe because you helped. Of course, I wanted to ask you to come home with me that same night, but I didn't dare. So you left me stranded all alone with my backpack, my bicycle, and my helmet. Thanks. You didn't mind." "I did mind. I was hurt. And yet now you're here with me in this room." He paused a moment. "Is this too much for you?" Now we're back to the cadenza thing. What's interesting, says Elio, is that after our friend Léon's cadenza quotes a few bars from the Waldstein Sonata, something crazy happens. "What?" he asked, almost overwhelmed by too many musical facts. I looked at the score and then once again, just to make certain that I wasn't making any of it up. It seems to me, and I'm not sure, that at some point after quoting the Waldstein, Léon dithers a while until he slips from the Beethoven to something that very possibly inspired another piece by Beethoven, something called the Kol Nidre. "Of course," he said. He was close to laughing. The Kol Nidre is a Jewish prayer. You see, the Jewish theme is very veiled, but it's smuggled into the cadenza. There are two ways in which your father could have known this tune. Either Léon hummed it or played it for him. Why, I have no idea, unless it was to prove that Jewish liturgy has beautiful music. Or your father attended a Yom Kippur service, which might suggest a closer bond between the two men. The service on that day is not an occasion for tourists to come and watch how Jews celebrate the Day of Atonement. Now, it turns out that they discovered something else, that Léon, his real name, was not Léon, it was Ariel, which means the same thing, lion. I thought of Ariel. The score was his love letter to the young pianist, his secret missive. "Play it for me, say Kaddish for me, remember the tune. It's hidden in there, under the Beethoven, next to the Mozart. Find me." Who knows under what dreadful, unthinkable conditions Léon had penned the cadenza to say, "I am thinking of you, I love you, play." And I thought of old Ariel, the Jew, who'd visit Adrienne's home even though he knew he was unwelcome. Ariel seeking refuge but being turned out, or worse yet, denounced, either by the father or by the mother or by the servants, probably with the blessings of the parents. Ariel attempting to flee to Portugal or England, or far worse, Ariel arrested by the French milice during one of those terrifying raids when Jews, young and old, were torn from their homes in the middle of the night and forced into packed cars. Then Ariel penned up somewhere, Ariel in the cattle cars, and finally Ariel beaten to death because he wouldn't part with his violin, which is likely now sitting in a German home with a family who might not even know the instrument was looted after its owner perished in a camp. And once again I thought of my life. Was there anyone who would send me a cadenza one day and say, "I'm gone, but please find me, play for me"? What is the name of the Jewish prayer? Kol Nidre, says Elio. Is it recited for the dead? No, that prayer is called the Kaddish. Do you know it? Every Jewish boy knows it. We're taught to rehearse the death of loved ones before we even know what death is. The irony is that the Kaddish is the only prayer one cannot use on oneself. Why is that? Because you can't recite it and be dead at the same time. You people. Thank you.
Hi, Andre.
Hi.
So I wanted to start by asking, so many of your novels, so many of your essays talk about the impossibility of trying to recreate what gave us pleasure, what made us happy. It could be a city, it could be a lover, and yet you have written a sequel. So what's going on, Andre?
I think that what gives us pleasure is, there are things that do give us pleasure. For example, I love to say that lasagna always gives me pleasure. I mean, that's the lowest denominator.
Pretty low.
And then you can do many things. And of course, I think that memory and imagination are sources of great pleasure. The memory of a place, say Paris, for many of us, is wonderful. Then you go to Paris and then you see what Paris is. And there's always that little flicker of disappointment. That's, oh, is this all Paris is? I thought it was going to be better this time. But it's Paris. That's what it is. And I love that some people will tell me, what did you expect? What was there not to like? Okay. So you asked me why did I write a sequel?
Well, going back to these characters, right?
Yeah.
So much of your book has that kind of Orphic energy of look back, but it won't be the same. So what was it like to come back to?
I know what you mean. It's basically, I knew when I started this. And I started many years ago and then gave it up because I couldn't write Call Me By Your Name again. And that's what would have happened had I basically picked up with Elio narrating his love for somebody else. So in essence, I had to go back and find a way into these characters whom I do love. I love them, I love their love, and of course now I love the father. And it was thanks to the father that I was able to sort of shoehorn my way into the story again without sort of declaiming, this is Elio speaking, Elio desiring somebody new. I couldn't do that again.
I heard that the idea of, or one of your ways into this new story was a conversation you had on a train?
Yes.
Can you tell us what happened?
It was a very short conversation, but I was coming from, actually it's ironic, I was coming from Bordighera, which is one of the towns that I was inspired by to write Call Me By Your Name, and they invited me there to give a talk. So I was on a train going there, and I was going back to Genoa. And on the train, this woman comes, and she has a dog with her, and she sits right next to me. And we start speaking. And at some point, she says, could you please hold the dog? I need to go to the bathroom. So I said, okay, I've never held a dog in my life, but I pretended it was totally natural. And we started speaking, and she was absolutely lovely. She told me about her father, who was very sick, and she was visiting him. And then she got off the train. We never exchanged numbers, nothing like that. There was no point. But it was such a wonderful personality, somebody who had a lot of energy and spunk, and she was also depressed at the same time because of her dad. And I was writing about my own father. I was on commission to write something about my father, and I stopped writing it, and I was on the commission. I started writing about her. And about being on a train and meeting somebody like that and wondering where would that conversation have gone. And that's when the idea came to me, this man is going to Rome, he's going to meet his son, whom can his son be? And I said, it can only be Elio, and therefore he must be the father of Elio. And that's how I started.
I mean, one of the questions I think that a lot of civilians have, that I have when I get to speak to novelists, is what is the germ of the book? So for you, does it begin with chance meetings? Does it begin with a character? Does it begin with a question? Can you even generalize?
No, I think it has to do with, in many respects, it's about loss, and more poignant is the fear of loss, the anticipation of, if I don't do something, I'm going to lose this person. This is what Oliver thinks. I might lose. And there is a sense that Michel and Elio, who are having a relationship that's quite passionate, Michel says to Elio, I know that at some point you're going to go, and I can live with that, but I don't want to lose you yet. Give me a few more months. And the same thing is said by Elio's father when he has this relationship with Miranda. Basically, he's assuming that this is going to last a day, and it doesn't.
You know, writers famously have very different relationships with their characters, right? There's some writers who say that as I'm writing, I'm constantly surprised that my character would make this decision or say this.
Right.
Then you have somebody like Nabokov who says, my characters are galley slaves. I hear them screaming. And I'm wondering, with these particular characters, about your own relationship with them. Did they surprise you in this book? Did they take you to places you...
Yes, they do.
Didn't
They do things that I would never have anticipated. I would never have written. I mean, when Elio takes a piece of fruit with him up in his bedroom, I would never have thought of that. But he took the fruit in his bedroom, and
you're just following him?
I just followed him. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to eat it. Can you do something else? Well, maybe if it makes you happy, you know. No, I mean, I have no idea what would happen, but...
Declaiming all responsibility.
I thought that my editor was going to say, Andre, this is embarrassing, cut this out. But he said the opposite. He says, no, we're keeping
This is
it.
an innovation.
Yes, it is. It is totally innovative. Anyway, but no, I think my characters are, because I cannot, first of all, I don't know how to write plot. Plot for me is just not existing. I don't know how to do it. And the second thing is that basically I don't do an outline.
Oh, you don't?
No. How could I possibly do an outline? I mean,
how could you not do an outline? What is happening at this desk?
No, I cannot do an outline. I mean, I just have to write the way I do. And many times I will change courses and change my mind. But if I had an outline, the first thing I would do is I would basically fail to obey it. So I don't have an outline. And it's a lot of work not having an outline, because then you really have to constantly invent and invent and invent. And if you're bad at plot, think of what disaster can happen.
But it's okay if you're not following plot or you're not interested in plot. I'm trying to figure out how you know when something isn't working. Is it a matter of intuition? Is it a matter of...
It's sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you don't know. And it's a good thing that I have some readers who tell me, Andre, really? But sometimes I will go along with what people say to me. I almost always do. But it's very seldom that people will say, don't do this. In other words, I will say something, and I have said many outlandish things, and sometimes I will say, this is too outlandish, but it stays in this version. And then when I re-look at the manuscript again, it says, it's still staying. I like it. I wrote it. It means something to me. So I will keep things. But it's always discovery, which is also fantastic, because if you don't discover and you plan ahead, it can be, in my case, it can be quite sterile.
Tell me something you discovered while writing this book.
In what? In Find Me? I discovered that, first of all, that Oliver can get drunk and that he can speak to Johann Sebastian Bach and have the most wonderful conversation with Bach. And Bach will tell him things that I never thought of, that basically music is the unlived life. And I think that the concept of the unlived life is, for me, the most staggering, the richest notion that any writer would want to explore. The fact that your life is here and there's another life that you could have lived, and that it's not going to be lived at all, that you are going to be in different cities over there, different careers, different many things, different religion for me is very important. And I mean, basically you have a whole life that is across the bank and you never cross the bank. And that is, for me, one of the dominant themes of my writing.
I've thought a lot about this obsession of yours with the unlived life, and but suspected it must have something to do with, your own personal history, right? Leaving Egypt, going to Paris, and are you also haunted by the André Aciman that might have existed had you stayed in Egypt? Had you
Yes,
lived in Paris?
it crosses my mind occasionally.
Yeah.
We don't speak to each other.
He doesn't speak to you?
No, he doesn't speak to me. He doesn't know me. Okay, he doesn't want to know. It's the first thing about it. No, but there is. It happens many times in life when you walk down a street and you look at a building, and you say to yourself, "God, that's a nice building." And then, by sheer coincidence, one day you find yourself renting an apartment in that very building. It's as if something has happened. I don't believe in fate, but if anybody wants to believe in fate, you can. And the converse is also true. In other words, you can say, I left this apartment, but part of me is still there. And I always love the example of asking people, how many people have, maybe some of you have, how many of you have called your old phone number? What did you expect to find? Who was going to answer? Somebody could answer, but it's not going to be you. But for a moment, you thought it was going to be you. And that's exactly how my life has been. In other words, there's a part of me that is still in Egypt, and a part of me that still goes on in Rome and in Paris. And they are there, sort of coddled there, sort of mummified, if you want. And I realize that I'm just a part of their entire sort of trajectory, just a small part. Or as a friend of mine used to say, when you have what you call amputated syndrome, some people say that, I left my arm in Egypt, and the rest of the body is here doing the work. And then you realize, no, wait a second. My body stayed in Egypt. I'm just the arm doing the job of an entire body, which could be the case. These are all sort of metaphors piled on each other, but it's the only way I can explain how feeling disjointed and displaced, what it can do to you.
I want to talk about fruit.
We're going to do this.
We're going to do this. I wasn't going to, but you started it.
I thought it was over.
So I was very interested and alarmed in hearing about your fan group that call themselves the Peaches.
Yes.
They are, I think, 25,000 people strong,
Yes.
and they travel every year to Italy in case anybody is, keen on joining them.
They might be here,
But I am, one of the things that people always note about your writing is its earthiness and its frankness and its willingness to talk about the body and to talk about sex. And you're not squeamish, you're not afraid in the same way so many American writers right now seem afraid to sort of write about sex. And I'm wondering, why is it interesting and important for you to put it on the page?
The sex part.
The sex part.
Why
Also the stone fruits.
Well, first of all, let's be candid, since we're there. It is very difficult to write about sex and not enjoy it. I mean, it's not like you're describing a bicycle, okay? Okay, you're describing two people basically enjoying each other. But that's not the only thing. I think that sex for me would mean very little if it weren't accompanied by the promise or the expectation of this kind of transference of identities. In other words, of this thing we call intimacy. It's not love. I never use the word love, but intimacy is very important. It's the ability to be open, frank, candid with somebody else, totally, to the point where, and I'll give you an example, where in my novel there's a moment in which Miranda will say to Sammy. That's the only thing I robbed from the film, by the way, the name Samuel. She tells Sammy, I'm going to tell you something because I want to clear all the secrets that I have from my life so that you know everything, so that I won't have any secrets. Of course, secrets are renewed also, but she thinks that she wants to tell him something, and she describes a scene of incest with her brother, or near incest, and she's very ashamed of it, and she's told no one in her whole life. And I wanted that scene because it is a moment of utter confession, and confession is the most powerful thing that can exist between two individuals. The ability, the courage to open up totally and say there's nothing behind this. As far as I'm concerned, today there's nothing behind this. Tomorrow there might be something, but right now nothing. And that is the part that I find the most interesting about sex. So the sex could be as graphic as you want. That's not the part that interests me. The part that interests me is the emotion of the transference of you and me. We might be the same person for this brief moment.
So many of the conversations about openness and intimacy in your work, feels to me, come from fathers or father figures. And I was wondering, if there was an antecedent, was your father open in this particular way? Does this kind of character that I feel like I keep running into in your fiction, in your essays, does he have?
My father was very important. He was a very open person, very frank, particularly about his sexuality. I think the whole city of Alexandria knew about his sexuality, which was very disturbing because my teachers also knew. But apart from that, he was also very open with me and said things that most people would never say because it's too much. And
like what?
I'm not going to say it in public. There's 300 people
I can
here.
try it.
I'll write it, okay? No, but he basically, there's an induction into the world of intimacy that is very important. And he was all for intimacy. So he was very honest and very frank about the things that happen and sometimes fail to happen in sex. And that was wonderful to hear all this when I was very young, because nobody tells you about anything like that. So I was always on my guard, and it helped me. And so I was trying to repeat this. And the fathers in my books are also very complex and unconventional fathers that are very close to their sons. In fact, very, very close to their sons, and almost have a desire to pass their identity on to their sons as well, which is also a form of love.
So you believe in intimacy, but here is the list of things that you don't believe in.
I'm sorry?
You believe in intimacy.
Yes.
But, while I was preparing for this, I was keeping a running list of things that you said you did not believe in, which is a lengthy list. And this is a favorite quote of mine of yours. I'm not a person who believes in things, and I'm critical of everything and everyone. I mean, I don't leave anything unturned. No stone is ever unturned. I've seldom in my whole life been in love with someone and not seen their defects right away, hoping that the defects might keep me alert to the dangers up ahead. And you've spoken against orthodoxies of all kinds, sentimentalism, easy belief. And I wonder, as I was, thinking about your work, where the novel fits into this, where writing fits into this. Is writing a sense of a place where there can be absolute belief, or does the novel for you kind of cultivate, again, a habit of mind, a kind of skepticism, a kind of distance? Not distance isn't the wrong word, but a certain kind of...
dislodgement, whatever, if you want to call it that. No, I think writing has to be a place for me where I seek out not coherence, because that's easy to find coherence, because we all want coherence in our lives. I've given up on coherence. But I do seek out paradox, and in paradox, I know how to negotiate my way through paradox. In other words, a contradiction does not scare me. it means that I'm closer to the truth. And writing for me, and the kind of writing I do, is in perpetual sort of search for those things that are difficult to accept, but that the labor to get to them is itself perhaps the reward. So I may never accomplish any truth. That's why my books never have a mission statement, contrary to what many people think. There's no mission statement, but there is also a search for how can I be as doubtful as I can be without being sort of a person who is a cynic. So you have to learn how to doubt and to fear security and beliefs, and at the same time not sort of trample on them either.
You once gave advice to young writers that sort of this is reminding me of, and you said the first rule if you want to write is to read the classics, and the second rule is to remember that writing is not a career, sometimes it is a mission. And so your writing has no mission statements, but for you the mission is the sort of dislodging a sense of certainty, remaining closely allied to doubt and paradox.
Yes, I think that's what it is. I mean, if it's not a mission, I don't like that word, but I think it's more or less like, I treat it as an avocation. I don't call myself a writer. I may be a teacher, which I do professionally, but as far as calling myself an author, I never use that term, because writing for me has always been something that I've done on the side. Yet it is the one thing that I'm proudest of and happiest to do if I have free time. There's nothing else I want to do, like eating lasagna is one of them. But playing tennis used to be a great joy, but not any longer. I mean, things like that. Going to the beach, I like the beach, sure. And listening to music, that's also fun. But fundamentally, it's always writing. And writing is something that if I had the time, I would do it all day long. And half the time, of course, I'm erasing what I've just written.
But I wonder, is it important? You say you do it all day long, but I wonder if it's important that it's the side thing. You know, that
I need to think it's a side thing, because otherwise I'm too scared.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not the kind of writer who says, I'm an author.
Yeah.
Okay? That's not me. That's too much of a pronouncement. And it carries a certain sense of arrogance, which I don't cultivate.
Yeah. But and yet, you know, in other interviews, you said that you knew you wanted to be a writer from very young.
Yes,
I did. So what did that look like to you when you were, like, I think it was like, you were 10, you said when you...
I was 10, I wrote poetry at the time. And there was no reason why I should write poetry, but it was something I did. And people took it very seriously. Of course, they had to, they pretended to, let's face it. But I took it seriously too, and it was nice to be writing poetry, to have this thing going on as I was eating lasagna at the same time.
Much lasagna is getting consumed.
But what I'm trying to say is that as soon as it became my profession, I become very doubtful of it. I become scared of it. So I always say I'm a professor, and I do write on the side. Of course, I write 90% of the time, and I teach 5% of the time, and I grade papers for the other 5%. But by and large, this is what I do. But I don't like to see myself as a writer because it scares me. It becomes my profession. And I've never been that way, so.
And whereas if it's on the side, it also has that aura of something illicit, something that you're sneaking off to do.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, I do sneak off to do it. I do it all the time, but there's a sense of, I never tell people, I can't see you today because I'll be writing. I never say that. And I always answer emails immediately. Because I would love to be interrupted, because I'm just writing. That's all I'm doing, okay? But by and large, it's one of the ways in which I pretend to be sort of more, it's an act of sprezzatura. You know, I pretend that I'm not a writer.
And you protect it from the sense of drudgery and obligation. And
yes.
at the same time, you know, about 10 books now. And I was wondering, how does... maybe a naive question, but something I've wondered. How do you get better as a novelist? How does a novelist continue to sharpen themselves?
You might as well ask Shakespeare how he became a better playwright.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. He was less. You take more risks. In other words, for me, writing a long sentence is very safe. Writing shorter sentences is sometimes bewildering, and at the same time, it scares me because I'm not writing a long sentence anymore. What's happening here? It's because I'm more confident, and at the same time, I want to be more precise. Whereas a longer sentence, though it has the claim of being very, very precise, is a way also of sort of scumbling and hiding behind the words. And I find that as you become better as a writer, you write faster and you write shorter. And I mean, the best example is E.M. Forster. If you look at his beginning novels, the first novels that he wrote, short stories, they're overlabored. And yet you look at the last things he wrote, they're essays mostly, quickly done, simple prose, but very elegant at the same time.
I want to leave some time for questions from the audience. I think we have some questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh God, they already came?
They're here. Oh, they're better than my questions. Oh, wow. This is. Let me start with. This is interesting. You write brilliantly and often about falling in love.
I'm sorry?
You write brilliantly. You just wanted to hear that again? You write brilliantly.
No, I think.
You write brilliantly, André.
Okay.
And often about falling in love. Yet you do not address falling out of love in comparable depth. Might there be a reason for this?
Yes. You should ask the same question to Jane Austen, who happens to be one of my favorite writers. I really, truly love Jane Austen. Basically, it's the scene that brings two individuals together. That is, and look at any kind of opera or comedy. It's usually, it ends in the marriage of two individuals. The coming together is finally resolved, and that's the end. What comes after you fall in love becomes what I call domestic drama. And the other thing I love to say is that what do you do with a couple that is living happily together, and on Sunday they do the laundry and they fold the towels and the sheets? It's very sweet, but it's of no interest to me as a writer. There's no barriers being crossed if you do that. Unless there's an adultery in the game, and then it's the same thing again.
But you're also talking about realism then, so you're not interested in realism.
I hate realism. I use the word, oh God. No, I mean, realism is a tradition in literature that I've never liked. I mean, going to Balzac, Zola, and Dickens, I mean, I enjoy reading them, but I don't take them seriously. Because realism is a tradition of writing that has always annoyed me. It's the job of a reporter writing fiction. And I think that what fiction should be trying to do is to ignore the world and focus on what two individuals or three individuals are discussing or doing together or trying to do. That is really what interests me the most. So the realism of daily life, I don't care about it.
It's a related question. What role did Proust have in your writing? Find Me or Call Me By Your Name.
Proust was essential to me because I discovered Proust when I was very young, thanks to my father, who was a Proustian. And together we went and bought the first volume of Proust that I've owned. And it was mind-blowing because I realized as I was reading Proust, and I was 14, and I was reading, I said, I can't read this. This is too close to me. It was way too close, and I felt very endangered. In other words, I was still reading Dostoevsky, whom I do love still. And that was easier. Proust was just me writing. But I found there were two things about Proust that really hit home. One is, of course, the whole tract about memory and remembering. How does memory affect us? What does it mean to remember and to imagine remembering, and so on? That is something that I took from Proust. But more importantly, Proust turned out to be an amazing anatomist of what individuals are, of how do they behave, what is it that they want, how do they hide who they are, and how does the anatomy of others and of oneself take up all the time that he's writing. In other words, people have compared Knausgaard to Proust. Now that's a big, big claim, which has absolutely no basis in reality. And I can go on about this, but I don't want to, because then I'll hang myself, I know. You want me to, don't you?
If it has to happen, this is as good a place.
No, but I mean, basically, Proust he examines everything. And I love that, because if you're examining anything, you don't have any patience for, storytelling, plot, events. You just don't care. World War I, he doesn't analyze World War I. He just tells us what it felt like walking when there's a blackout in Paris. And whom do you run into during a blackout? That great literature.
Do you still reread Proust?
I teach Proust, yes,
teach, yeah.
so I have to reread him, yeah.
So what do you see now, maybe that you didn't see when you were younger? Or you're probably seeing new things all the time?
You see new things every single time, new sentences. And I teach by the sentence, so I look at a few sentences, and we look at the sentence for 2 hours, and it's amazing. For me, I don't know what my students think. They're probably bored to death. But it is amazing to just look at a few sentences and say, the whole novel is there in those 2 sentences.
This is a question about your process. When writing for queer characters or other characters unlike yourself, do you share your work with early readers, and has their feedback ever surprised you?
When
you're writing queer characters or
queer
characters unlike
yeah.
yourself, do you get feedback from other people? Has it surprised you?
I show them to people around me, and they've told me, this is good, this is bad, this is fine. I think the question has a subtext. In other words, do I show it to queer people in order to get their feedback and say, is this position correct? No, I don't do that. Yeah. I think that's what the question was trying to elicit. No, but I show them to the people who are closest to me, and I listen to their feedback, and the feedback is usually not, this is incorrect, this could not happen. It's more like, you went too far, maybe this is not the right thing to say right now. Maybe the character needs to have a few more days yet. So I listen to people.
It's a question again about dislocation, migration, exile. Do you think the characters in your books, from Call Me By Your Name to Find Me, would have such depth and chemistry without them living through migrating and living in various places like you did?
No, they wouldn't. They need to. Basically, it's what I project on them. I project on them the fact that they're fundamentally not just unconventional in their desires, but they're also unhinged in the world that they live. So to go to Call Me By Your Name, which is amazing because the film picked up on that and went a step further. In Call Me By Your Name, it's an Italian-American family. In other words, the mother is Italian, the father is American, the boy speaks Italian at home or English. And then the film did something extra. They added French, which for me made perfect sense because it was exactly the kind of world that I grew up in, where everybody spoke French, Arabic, in my case Arabic, French, Italian, and English, and sometimes Greek. So when you have this kind of plural world, you have characters who are not going to be your basic person who grew up, say, in Queens, and basically knows Manhattan well, and that's about it. These are people who are basically pulled all over the world, and they have various what you might call sort of antecedents that are a bit everywhere. And I like that. And so my characters are like that. Even Oliver, who grew up in New England, happens to be Jewish and is in Italy, and now he's going to go back to Italy maybe, and has a family, but also is gay. There's a kind of, everything is never, there's, what's the word that people use nowadays, which I don't like very much, but there's a kind of fluidity about them. They're fluid in every single sense of the word. And that I like best. I mean,
prompting a question for me. I mean, you have all of these languages. Why write in English?
Because I always went to English schools, and so that was my training, was in English. I know French, but ask me to write a letter in French, I don't even know the cliche formulations. In Italian, it's just as difficult. I mean, I can write a letter, but it will sound like a 3-year-old wrote it. And I mean, I do a lot of interviews in French and Italian, and I'm totally fluent, but I know that I'm not able to master the nuances the way I want to in English. So I write in English, which is not my mother tongue.
It's a question actually touching on this idea. It's a question about the process of writing and publishing your first book, which I gather you were a little uncomfortable about because you weren't as confident in English. And you were worried about writing outside of your mother tongue.
Yes. Yeah. Well, my first book I wrote it when I was 37 or 38. And I didn't know if the kind of prose I was writing was marketable. In other words, would people read this kind of prose? Little did I know that they did. I mean, we're talking about Out of Egypt. And which has still remained is always sold for the past 25 years. So it's done okay. But I was not confident when I handed in the manuscript. I thought they were going to say, your sentences are just not English. They're not American English. And I still feel that this is something that some people hold in some way. That this is not the kind of English that we write here, André Aciman. Okay, but I'm very, very insecure about my English, and my prepositions go to hell because I'll never learn prepositions in English. Never.
I think that's a decent note to end on. To hell with prepositions.
Well, yes.
And realism. Thank you so much. André will be signing books.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.